Hello, I'm Joanna Berger, and I have a Master's of Science in Applied Animal Behavior and Animal Welfare from the University of Edinburgh. I'm first going to speak about abnormal repetitive behaviors. So these are behaviors that are performed repeatedly, and they are unvarying and functionless. We see many different types of abnormal repetitive behaviors in parrots, and after this section of the talk focusing on abnormal behaviors, I will have a series of videos showing these behaviors in various captive parrots. So the first behavior I'm going to talk about is swaying, which is just when a parrot, is leaning back and forth. And then there's also pacing, so just walking back and forth. Another repetitive behavior that often goes unnoticed is tongue flicking. Usually it looks like the parrot's tongue is flicking up and down. There can be corner flips, where orange-winged Amazons will turn small circles at the top corner of their cage. And there can be route tracing, where it is similar to the perch circling. It's just walking along the exactly identical route every time. Of course, parrots can be walking around in their cage, and that is great. We want them to be climbing and we want them to be getting exercise. What we don't want is them tracing the exact same route over and over. It's similar, and there can be repetitive wire chewing or cage bar chewing, so gnawing repeatedly on the bars of the cage. The parrot may pull violently at the wire and make a snapping sound. These movements involve identical body postures or are in identical locations in the cage. The real key to abnormal repetitive behaviors are that they are performed in an identical way every single time. It is normal for certain species of parrots to enjoy drumming and making percussive sounds, which would be similar to that wire springy sound described in the wire chewing stereotypy. But if it becomes obsessive and is repeated in the exact same way for a long period of time, or in recurring bouts, may be starting to be an abnormal behavior. Those are some examples. Some of those will be difficult to tell from normal behaviors, but the key is an abnormal repetitive behavior is repeated in an identical way every time and has no apparent function. Then what is often noticed by people caring for parrots are the self-directed abnormal repetitive behaviors, which one example of which is feather destructive behavior, chewing on the feathers, and feather picking, where the parrot will reach down and pull out his own feathers. That's why we see so many captive parrots with bare, bald patches, often on their chests and abdomens. There is a more severe self-directed abnormal behavior, which is self-mutilation. You may not notice this at first if it is occurring under the bird's wings. I have seen a sun conure patient who had wounded herself under her wings from repetitively chewing a hole through her skin and causing a bleeding wound under each wing. I have also seen many parrots chew holes through their chest, right above the sternum. Can be an area where that often occurs, and they'll start by it can start as feather picking, but then it becomes much more severe. They'll injure their skin, and then they can chew through their muscle, and I've seen some very serious wounds where parrots have destroyed a large section of their muscles, and that is, very bad for their health and they need to be seen by a vet and have the wound treated, but it's very hard to treat the wound because they have this habit of chewing in that area. Loud vocalizations are very common. Squawking and screaming can be normal behaviors. They are the ways that birds will communicate in the wild, but these can become abnormal. Often parrots that don't have any social enrichment or have very little social enrichment will scream repetitively. So imagine if one individual is separated from a flock, the contact call is this loud scream that will be made to get in touch with the rest of the flock until the single bird finds its flock or its mate. And we do know that Amazon parrots do communicate with their families through different vocal dialects, and there's a lot of important social learning of vocalizations, which is totally natural. But in captivity, if a bird is isolated, they will do this contact call, and then it becomes this constant screaming. And at that point, I would consider it to be a little abnormal if it's being, if the screaming is just going on for an extended amount of time repetitively, and the bird's doing very little else. So those are the main issues. And basically anything that is repetitive and functionless is a sign that the parrot is stressed. There is some underlying emotional problem, and the parrot is using this repetitive behavior to cope with the stress of it, that it's experiencing in its environment. And these may be it may be that the parrot is bored and just needs something to do, and that's all that they can do, and then they become addicted to doing it or obsessed with doing that. So we definitely need to provide more enrichment for those birds, and be careful to watch for the more subtle signs like swaying or tongue oral stereotypies. And now I will have a little break from me talking, and I'll show you a series of videos of abnormal parrot behaviors.
Noisy bird used to be.
So we've seen some examples of abnormal repetitive behaviors, and now I want to clarify that all of these repetitive behaviors are symptoms of, or can be symptoms of, underlying stress. So it is important to provide enrichment and modify behavior and change the bird's environment so that that underlying stress is decreased. It is not enough to just place a collar on a bird or prevent them from picking their feathers out, because the stress will still be there even if the bird is not able to perform the repetitive behaviors. So abnormal repetitive behaviors are a symptom of stress. However, they are a way that the individual is coping with that stress. What is a more severe problem is a bird that is being kept in a barren, small enclosure, and unfortunately this is very common. Often birds are in very small cages with a single perch, very little space, and little to no enrichment. And some of these birds will become depressed, and they'll just shut down and stand still and be very inactive. And many bird owners think that there's nothing wrong with the bird, and this is how a bird should be. It's nice and quiet. You know, you don't see the unusual behaviors like pulling out the feathers. You just see a bird that stands still all the time, is very inactive, basically not performing many behaviors. That can be depression, and those birds may be experiencing even more severe stress than the birds who are able to cope by performing abnormal repetitive behaviors. So I've seen a parrot, for example, who was kept in a very small cage and like didn't have any social enrichment at all. The owners barely interacted with him. He was an only bird in the household, singly housed, and he became depressed and lethargic and spent a lot of time standing still. Eventually he was moved to a parrot aviary that had other birds and a lot of enrichment, and with enrichment provision he did start to come out of his shell and become more active. But that is something to look out for: depressed behavior. This, you know, these birds who stand very still, and that can also be a sign that they're in an improper environment. Finally, I want to talk about aggression and resource access. Many species of birds will compete for a key resource, and this could be food or a mate or something that is seen as a mate. A lot of research has been done on this with chickens, and it's found that chickens will fight more if all of their food is in a single location, and there'll be less aggression between the birds if the food is scattered or spread evenly around the enclosure. So a great idea, if you have multiple birds living in the same enclosure in captivity, is to have multiple feeding stations. And you can have food all throughout the enclosure to decrease aggressive behavior between the birds. Amazon parrots are known to be very aggressive towards one another. They do fight more severely than some other species of birds in captivity. So there will be species differences in general aggression levels and fighting styles, but as far as I know, basically all species of birds will compete over resources, and these resources may be toys or anything that the birds want to get to. A lot of the time you see birds that live in homes as pets competing over the human owner and the attention from the owner, and this can be especially pronounced if it's if it's mating season and the birds see the human as their mate, and so they're competing over attention from their human mate. We also need to watch if you have multiple birds in an aviary or in any other captive setting. Make sure that all the birds are getting equal access to food. There may be a little dominance hierarchy that develops, so more dominant individuals may may have access to the better food and may be the ones eating first. You can help all the birds have access to all the resources by spreading them throughout the enclosure or the home or cage. And I found in my dissertation research that African parrots do have small territories within an aviary, so there is evidence saying that, you know, these little territories do affect access to resources, including foraging and enrichment resources. So make sure that everything, all the key resources, food, enrichment items, water, and perches are accessible to each individual, or at least each mated pair or social group within your enclosure. But generally, spreading resources evenly throughout an enclosure is recommended to reduce interbird aggression. And I could talk more about aggression towards people. I'll quickly say that sometimes that can be natural behavior. If a person is reaching into a bird's cage, the bird may become stressed and start defending his territory. Doing a lot of behavior modification through positive reinforcement training is the best way to get birds used to having hands go into their cages, into their territories, and get used to having the birds participate voluntarily in veterinary procedures. And certain techniques from psychology can be used, such as applied behavior analysis, to assess the result of the behavior. So if the bird bites the owner, when the owner sticks his hand into the cage, and then after the bite occurs, the owner pulls his hand, removing it from the cage, using applied behavior analysis, we can assess that situation. So you first had the antecedent, which is what happens before the behavior occurred. So right before the biting occurred, the hand was placed into the cage. Then you have the behavior, which is the bite, and the consequence. The consequence will either make the behavior more likely or less likely to occur in the future. So in this case, the consequence was the hand being removed from the cage. That is the removal of a stressful stimulus. So the bird will be more likely to bite in the future because the bird has learned, if I bite, this scary hand is removed from my cage and my stress is relieved. So discussing learning theory with bird owners can be a really useful way to help them understand whether they might accidentally be rewarding certain behaviors that they don't want. And maybe these are natural behaviors like screaming, but if you only pay attention to your bird when your bird is screaming, then your bird will be more likely to spend more time screaming more frequently, more loudly, and that can be really disruptive in the home. So as a behavior consultant and clinical behaviorist, I have these discussions with my clients. So now we're moving on to discussing normal behaviors of parrots and the natural behaviors that occur in the wild, and different, I'm going to also discuss different ways that we can provide enrichment and training programs so that we can elicit these natural behaviors in captive settings. So luckily, some studies have been done on the orange-winged Amazon, and also there's ongoing research in Peru at this clay lick that's being done by Donald Brightsmith. So I encourage you to look up Donald Brightsmith's work on the macaws and other parrots who frequent this clay lick in Peru. So we have different categories of normal behaviors, and first I'll talk about foraging. So foraging behavior is seeking and searching for food, and Parrots in the wild spend a great deal of their time looking for food, climbing from branch to branch, finding fruits and nuts, and then tearing these apart, holding them, and sometimes picking off a stalk and holding that stalk and then chewing the berries or fruit off of that, or just holding a large fruit in with their foot and then chewing the flesh off, dropping it, and chewing open the seed and eating the seed. Most parrots mainly eat fruit seeds, or fruit and seeds, and they also will eat nuts. They have these really powerful beaks that have evolved to crack open nuts and seeds and tear apart the flesh of fruit. And so those beaks need to be constantly chewing. So another natural behavior, in addition to looking for the fruit and seeds, and other food items, another is going to be the chewing behavior and all those fine beak movements. There's a lot of muscles at the sides of the beak, and they should always very, very, very frequently chew and destroy items with their powerful beaks. And then usually all of the items that they tear apart with their beak and destroy will be dropped on the ground. So sometimes people get frustrated with the frequency with which parrots chew and destroy and drop things on the ground in captivity because it's messy for us, but that is a totally natural behavior for them. So constant chewing. Yeah, they also can, if they don't have access to natural items to chew, they can redirect that onto wooden toys or pieces of cardboard or your walls of your house if you have a pet parrot. They can, so they can use different items as foraging substitutes. So items that can be manipulated and destroyed can be used to elicit and simulate that chewing and destroying behavior. Some species of parrots dig. All of the parrots in Ecuador nest in cavities, either in trees or sometimes in cliffs maybe, and in termite mounds. And they are extremely social and have very complex social communication through body postures. There's various agonistic and affiliative body postures as well as vocalizations. When they mate or are courting, they will groom one another, and during actual mating, they will sit, one bird the male mounts the female and stands on her back. But that's the only time that another parrot will have that sense. It's the only time a parrot has the sensation of someone touching their back. And it's the only time that a parrot will get onto the back of another bird, is during copulation, during mating. A lot of people like to pet parrots and touch their backs, but that can simulate, be perceived as a mating behavior by your pet parrot and cause a lot of issues. You can also, during courting and mated pairs, groom each other, and they especially will preen each other's heads. Again, a lot of people like to pet parrots on their head, but that also can be seen as a mating type behavior and can lead to more abnormal behavior with parrots trying to mate with people and being confused and frustrated. We have all the parrots in Ecuador are monogamous and will be in mated pairs and mate for life. Occasionally we do see triads, So 3 parrots who are mated and just in a threesome, but usually it's a pair, and these are very closely affiliated mates who will live together for their entire lives. And even Darwin said that he thought that parrots could be heartbroken and depressed and sad when a mate passed away. And anecdotally, there are many times when a bird has, like a macaw, has lost a mate. I know one case study where a scarlet macaw had another macaw as her mate, and he died, and then she developed a lot of abnormal behavior and started becoming more aggressive and pulling out her feathers. And then later in her life, she was able to be in another social group of macaws in a large aviary, and eventually the abnormal behavior subsided and she's no longer picking her feathers. So social enrichment is incredibly important for these birds. Other behaviors we need to notice and think about are locomotory behaviors like flying and climbing, walking across the ground, and they even will play. And there's a lot of foraging behaviors to reach different fruits and nuts, in which the parrots will grip onto a small branch and then hang upside down. All of these movements with the feet and legs, and that, you know, hanging upside down, balancing on perches, and walking and climbing and flying for long distances, that's all exercise. And it's really important for birds to be able to do that in captivity, or else their muscles will atrophy. Some captive parrots have really poor foot health because they only have a very basic perch that's all one width. Really, we should be providing parrots with many perching opportunities, branches of different widths and even different positions. So sometimes in the wild, parrots land on an almost vertical branch, or a branch that's at a very interesting angle, whereas in captivity we tend to only have a horizontal perch. So we can have tapered perches that are narrow at one end and thicker at the other. You can also have springy perches to simulate the movement of branches in nature. You know, branches are much springier than your average wooden dowel perch. You can have lots of toys to allow parrots to hang upside down, and you can place different items in the cage so that they can climb up to get them, or, you know, so they have to hang upside down to reach them. You can even put toys or food items on springy, rubbery type suspension hanging from the ceiling, and then the parrot can climb up and go upside down and swing around on that springy material while chewing and getting at the food, or playing with the toy and chewing the toy. And we want to make sure that all those locomotory behaviors are being expressed in captivity to promote all, not only their behavioral health, but also physical health. And other normal physical movements include stretching, and I've talked a little bit about gripping perches and how important that is. You know, we also have grooming, which I mentioned briefly, and another behavior to mention is bathing. There was a really nice study by Murphy et al., which looked at captive orange-winged Amazons and described their behaviors during bathing. So the researchers took a spray bottle and sprayed water over these orange-winged Amazons and then recorded all of the movements that the birds made, and they found that these birds made very similar movements to wild Amazons. They even did hang upside down, and they stretched out their wings. So here is the diagram from that study. And this is simulating rain, as would occur in the wild, with a spray bottle. And they also found that, you know, not only did individuals perform all of these varied behaviors, even Amazon parrots who were not sprayed with the spray bottle, but who were in adjacent cages, copied these behaviors. So there's some social facilitation and social learning that goes on around bathing behavior. They also found that after spraying these birds with water and having that little bath, the parrots were less likely to spend time preening themselves. So it seemed that preening does relate to cleaning and bathing. And there have been a lot of other studies of Amazon parrots. Most of these were done at UC Davis in California by the researchers Meehan, Garner, and Joy Mensch, and they were done with captive orange-wing Amazons to study different ways to enrich the environments of captive birds. So some of the enrichments that they used, I'm going to go through with you, and some of their findings. One enrichment that was successful was providing orange-winged Amazons with larger pellets to eat, so that they spent more time holding the large food pellet in their feet and chewing on it and manipulating it. If they were just given smaller sized pellets, they didn't spend as much time manipulating their food, and so they weren't performing as many of their natural foraging behaviors. So it's definitely recommended that you provide captive parrots with larger food items that so that they can hold the food item in one foot and then chew on it and move it around. So they did prefer to have to eat the larger ones rather than the small ones, even though it took more energy. So that's an example of parrots enjoying working for their food. Another example is using puzzle feeders, which have been found to decrease fear levels in captive orange-winged Amazons. So allowing these birds to have the opportunity to work for their food by solving a food puzzle decreased their stress, decreased their fear behaviors, and increased exploratory movements around their cage. And so some of the foraging enrichment puzzles that these birds were provided with were called t-shirt bags, which was just a sack of cotton cloth hung on a rope from the top of the cage filled with food. Or there was a fruit cage, which was a cylindrical metal cage that was hung with a chain from the top of the cage, and then food was placed into the small fruit cage. And there was a toy box, which was a plastic cube with holes and doors of various sizes and different shapes that was hung from the top of the cage. And a treat basket, just a woven basket, was filled with food and then hung from the top of the cage. And so they worked to get food out of all of those. And there were physical enrichments provided in this study, which included Boeing perches, the spiral rope perch that hangs and swings, and then hanging toys, also a bridge made of wood and rope it's like a swinging ladder that they could perch on. And and it was found that adding enrichment did decrease their fear, and it reduced stereotypic behaviors as well. So abnormal behaviors can be reduced by adding enrichment. Really, parrots need to be working for all of their food, especially parrots like macaws and Amazons, but all parrots are intelligent and can enjoy foraging enrichment. You can get creative with enrichment. This is just, I've just listed some that were just used in this study, but there's so many more options. Different type, you can provide birds with different types of wood to chew. You can create a tray and fill it with like wood, like pine bark mulch chips, and then put some food underneath so that the birds have to dig and sort through the mulch to get to the food. You can put different things into their food bowls, like paper, or even some studies have put marbles into parrots' food bowls. And we've found, I mean, lots of research has shown that parrots are very intelligent and enjoy solving problems. So please, you know, get creative. Let's do everything we can to provide an enriched environment for captive birds. And next, I'm going to show you some examples of different ways that Ecuadorian birds or South American birds have had are kept in captivity at a parrot sanctuary, which has does a pretty decent job of providing some social enrichment.